Good afternoon, West Louisville. Good afternoon, West Louisville, and welcome to the Simmons College of Kentucky West Louisville Forum. Let's have a little round of applause for Simmons and the West Louisville Forum. Solutions for Urban America. We are so glad that you came out for this remarkable series, and for today's speaker, which our featured speaker is Dr. Nancy Ditomaso, who is going to be bringing us some amazing information. You're going to want to take notes. And now let's welcome the president of Simmons College of Kentucky, Dr. Kevin W. Cosby.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here. Oh, this is a great attendance. I don't want to delay our speaker. I read her book several years ago, and I thought her analysis of the problem of inequality captures it like no other book that I have ever read. And we are honored to have this brilliant scholar, associate dean at the School of Social Work at Rutgers University, and that is Dr. Nancy Ditomaso. Won't you receive her now at this time as she comes?
Actually, I'll give that back to you. Okay. Good day to you. I am delighted to be here, and certainly very honored to have been invited to share the work that I've been doing on issues of racial inequality. And I know that it may be a little bit difficult to actually see the presentation that I put together, but hopefully it will be useful for me to at least point out some of the things that are on the charts and so on. I have a presentation that is far too long for what the time was that was allotted, so I'm not going to be presenting all of it. I just want to hit some of the highlights. And so as I skip through some things, that's intended because I want to be sure that I stay within the allotted time. So can we have the presentation, please? Okay, as it was mentioned, I'm Nancy Ditomaso. I'm from Rutgers University, from the business school, Rutgers Business School, Newark and New Brunswick, and I was vice dean for faculty, but I am now just a faculty member. The book that I wrote, published in 2013, is called The American Non-Dilemma: Racial Inequality Without Racism. And the title of the book, The American Non-Dilemma, some of you may recognize is an allusion to a famous book that was written in 1944 called An American Dilemma by Gunnar Myrdal. And Myrdal argued in that book in 1944, which was thought of as the definitive statement about issues of racial inequality, that America would solve its problems of racial inequality because of the incompatibility of the growing recognition of racial inequality and the conflict with American values of egalitarianism and fairness and so on. And I began to ask myself, when I started teaching courses in the business school on managing diversity in organizations, why it was that my students, who were mostly white, particularly young men in their mid-20s, didn't seem to have a dilemma about racial inequality, and in fact thought it didn't have much to do with them. So that's how I came to write this book, which I call The American Non-Dilemma, to try and explain why we don't recognize the importance of racial inequality and have not been moved to solve the problems. And hopefully we can have some conversation around that. So I'm going to skip through the first couple slides. We know that lots and lots of things have been happening over the last several years that have made the issue of racial inequality very salient for people across the country. In fact, there's a lot more people that think about racial issues as something that needs to be addressed. But the point that I want to call our attention to is that when the news media talks about racial inequality, when academic people talk about racial inequality, when churches talk about racial inequality, and many other discussions, the explanations that are given all come down to saying that it's because of racism and discrimination. And I would like to suggest that maybe we need to rethink that way of understanding racial inequality, because the very focus on racism and discrimination, I would argue, is one of the things that allows whites in particular to remove themselves from the conversation and think that race has nothing to do with them, because they say, I'm not a racist, I haven't done anything wrong to people, so it's not my problem, it's someone else's. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that argument. I'm going to give you a little bit of evidence from it, and then draw some conclusions and hopefully have a conversation. So I'm going to skip through all this. Okay. So, 3 main points to that argument that I want to make. The first one is that we should be thinking not so much about racism and discrimination in terms of what bad things whites do to black people and others, or that men do to women, for example, but we should be thinking about what good things whites do for other whites. Essentially, white advantage, preference, favoritism, the way that whites help each other, is more of the dynamic of how racial inequality gets reproduced, particularly in this generation, than whites doing bad things actively to black people and others. Second of all, when you talk about racial inequality, particularly at a policy level, everyone says, well, I believe in equal opportunity. Equal opportunity is thought of as the solution to the problems of racial inequality. But I would like to suggest, based on the research that I did, that most whites and others, but particularly whites, essentially live lives of unequal opportunity, and they intentionally, actively, and purposely seek out unequal opportunity. Why? So that they can get ahead, have advantages, provide advantages to their children. That's how we talk about those kinds of things. So in fact, while everyone says, I believe in equal opportunity, in fact, no one wants to be in a competition that they don't know they're going to win. And so they call on their friends, they use their family members, they use acquaintances, all of whom, of course, primarily look like them, in order to get an inside edge, to get jobs that will support them and their families. So we talk about equal opportunity, but whites live lives of unequal opportunity. Third, while in America, not just whites, everyone, you ask people, how do you get ahead in the US? Everyone will say hard work, effort, motivation. But in fact, and the people I talked to, by the way, when I said, how did you have the kind of life you have, they all say, because I worked hard, because I was motivated, because I tried my best. But in fact, 99% of the people that I talked to essentially drew on their social networks from family, neighborhood, friends, acquaintances to get jobs throughout their lives. And as I'm going to show you, 70% of the jobs that people got over their lifetime, I'm not talking about 70% of the people, I'm talking about 70% of the jobs that people held, they got them because someone helped them. And I'm talking about white people. So those three issues. We need to talk about white advantage instead of black disadvantage, or white advantage instead of racism and discrimination. We need to talk about unequal opportunity instead of equal opportunity, and we need to talk about group-based social connections instead of individual achievement. Okay, so I would just want to present first to get us in the frame of mind of what's been happening. Some research that was actually done by friends of mine. Don Tomaskovic-Devi and Kevin Steinbach have a book came out just before mine called Documenting Desegregation. And in this book, they essentially ask the question, and I want to share with you very briefly the data from it, what has happened in the United States in terms of access to jobs since the Civil Rights Act was passed about 50 years ago? Essentially, this is what they found using access that's now available for some researchers to what's called EEOC-1 data from the U.S. Department of Labor, or wherever it comes from now. And they traced for millions of enterprises from 1966 to the present in terms of who is getting which kinds of jobs. Essentially, what they found was that white men have retained, even increased, their representation in the best jobs in the last 50 years. Furthermore, they found that while there was a brief desegregation between the jobs held by white men and black men from 1966 to 1980, slight shift, nothing more has happened in terms of the desegregation of jobs between white men and black men since 1980. We're talking about over 35 years. Similarly, what they find is that there was a gradual shift in terms of the segregation of white men from white women in the jobs that they held, but that essentially leveled off and nothing more has happened since about 2000. And then finally, nothing much happened with black women in general in terms of their access to the kinds of jobs that white men held. It was very gradual. It didn't change much at all over time. So I'm going to show you that data very quickly and then get to my main point, and I need to keep looking for the time. Okay. So I know you can't see this very well, but I'm just going to hit the highlights of it. This essentially is one of the key tables from this book, which shows what's called an index of segregation, which means what proportion of people would have to change jobs if white men and others were equally distributed in jobs. And this goes from 1966 to 2005 when they did this analysis. And this line on the bottom is black men compared to white men. So it shows the proportion of black men who would have to change jobs in order to be equally distributed in the kinds of jobs held by white men. So this shows you that in 1966, about 65% of black men would have had to change jobs to be equally distributed with white men. You see the gradual decline down to around 55 or so percent in 1980, and then you see a flat line. Nothing more has happened in terms of the desegregation of jobs held by white men and black men for 35 years. The top line is black women. It was 85%. It's now still about 80%. Hardly anything has changed in terms of black women working in the kinds of jobs that white men work in. The middle line is white women. There was a very gradual change. It accelerated a bit, and then it leveled off, so that white women are now in about the same position as black men. That's what has happened in terms of who has access to jobs since the civil rights movement was passed. Perhaps even more startling, this is a different kind of representation that shows, this is called an index of representation, not segregation here. And this 0 is the 0 line, which shows that if you're above the line, you're overrepresented in that kind of job compared to your availability in the labor force. If you're below the line, you're underrepresented in that kind of job. This table shows you managerial jobs from 1980 to 2005. And this line is white men, which shows you white men were 60% overrepresented in managerial jobs in 1980, and they're still 60% overrepresented in managerial jobs in 2005, and it hasn't changed since. The bottom line is black women, 80% underrepresented in 1980, still 80% underrepresented. The middle line is black men, 60% underrepresented in 1980, still 60% underrepresented. This line is white women. They were overrepresented. There's been a slight improvement, but they're still underrepresented. I'm going to not go through the details. This is professional jobs. White men overrepresented by 40% in professional jobs. Some shifts for white women in particular, not much for black men and women since 1980. So that's the picture that we're looking at. And one of the key questions, of course, is why hasn't that changed more? And I would suggest that maybe we are looking at the wrong things. By looking primarily at whites doing bad things to black people, discrimination, we are essentially missing the action of whites doing good things for white people to make sure they get into those good jobs. Essentially, we're looking at exclusion when we should be looking at how whites make sure that they include people like themselves. So again, hopefully you can see this set of pictures here. I was so proud of myself finding them, and I'll move over. But all of the news media, all of the academic literature, most of the conversation around racial inequality in jobs focuses in on this: keeping people out, the bias against blacks and others to keep them from getting jobs. But I would argue that most of the way people get jobs, based on the study I did, essentially is the bias that whites show for other whites, helping them get into good jobs. Now there's this other thing in the middle which I call the absence of advantage. Susan Fiske, a famous psychologist, calls it indifference or ambivalence. And in general, I would say, in the post-civil rights period, most of what goes on is the bias for whites by other whites and indifference or ambivalence toward other people. Basically not helping them, not hurting them, leaving them alone. They're on their own, but in the most part, they don't get in. Whereas disadvantage, the bias against blacks, certainly it happens. It happens in places, particularly if there's a sense of competition and threat, but that is not the primary dynamic by which people get jobs in the post-civil rights period. Now, when I was developing this argument and people talked to me about it, they'd said, oh, but what's different about that? If whites help other whites and whites are getting good jobs, that's just another form of discrimination. But I would argue that it isn't. It's fundamentally different, and it's important for us to focus in on the way whites help other whites and give them advantages in the job market, rather than only thinking about this as a process of racism or discrimination. First of all, discrimination is illegal, and favoritism is not. Discrimination is someone harming you despite what you do. Favoritism is something that people do for you no matter what you haven't done. Even more so, I'm going to skip this for right now, but even more so I would say that there are cognitive, social, political, and legal differences between thinking about racial inequality as a result of the favoritism, preference, and advantages that whites provide to other whites versus the disadvantage and discrimination that we think occurs in the job market for blacks. So first of all, if whites thought of themselves as actively discriminating against blacks, they would feel bad about themselves. But if they're just helping their friends and family members, they feel good about themselves. So cognitively, it's a completely different experience. Similarly, socially, people who discriminate and are known to discriminate are condemned. But people who help their friends are lauded and appreciated and given all kinds of pats on the back. Politically, discrimination invokes social movements, but favoritism does not, because we never think about it, and we never think that that is something that we should change. And then, as I mentioned, discrimination is illegal and favoritism is not. Okay, so when you think about this, white and male privilege is the privilege not to be a racist and still to benefit from racial inequality. So you can feel good about yourself as someone who believes in civil rights, doesn't discriminate, and yet you gain access that others don't have just because you're in a network of people who have helped each other and they're in a position to help. Similarly, this kind of privilege is completely legal, and it gives people the benefit of the doubt, and it's routine. It's simply the normative way in which people find jobs. I'm going to skip this and go to my data. So first of all, in terms of the data, I did interviews with randomly selected white people between the ages of 25 and 55 in New Jersey, Ohio, and Tennessee. I talked to almost 250 people, and I got detailed job histories. From the time they were in high school to the time I talked to them, I asked them about every job they had. And essentially what I found, this table shows you working class and middle class. Working class is the red line, middle class is the blue line, and this is the proportion of people who got jobs by someone helping them for their first job, second job, third job, etc., up to the 10th job. Now, not everybody had 10 jobs. Some people had more than 10 jobs, but what you see is that 60% of the jobs when people are in high school or early college get jobs with people helping them, and then it goes up to 70–80% over their life course, with an average of about 70% of jobs people held. So in the 250 people I talked to, I heard about 1,500 jobs. 70% of those 1,500 jobs people got because somebody helped them. They helped them either because they gave them information that other people didn't have, they used influence on their behalf, this is my friend, helped them, or they actually had a job they could offer them. What happened here? The projector went out? Okay, let me just do one thing. If I could have that page that I handed you, the one that's on the floor there. Let me just give you one example of this, and then I'll stop. Again, I interviewed 250 or so people all over the country, and let me just give you an example of one person. Okay, this happened to be a working class guy from Ohio. Politicians, please note, I talked to a lot of working class white men in Ohio about issues like immigration and affirmative action and their views of government and taxes and so on. This happened to be one of them. So I said, and how did you get that job? Well, he said, I was working at a lumber yard here. My father's friend owned it. And then his next job. I went and got a job at this firm. I met a guy down at the shore in a summer house that was a union representative. I was waiting to get into the skilled trades. In fact, the supervisor lives here. It was just a matter of time, but then the plant closed. Next job. I did get 3 months at a truck factory that was from a guy I knew down at the boatyard. And then another job. Well, I did odd jobs with a guy who had worked at this plant I had worked for before. Then his best job, well, a guy from this nearby town whose father was a supervisor at the industrial company had his own sons on the job. He said, there's a process. You just don't get hired overnight. He must have had a good access because in this company you get hired by seniority. So he must have had a little wait for somebody to hire me, to be hired first. They ask you for overtime first for the rest of your life. That's why I was hired a week before everybody else. They basically told me to wear like a tennis shirt, looking like a very athletic person, because they know you'll get into the higher paying job. And it's a difference of about $30,000 a year. I really don't know how they hired. It seems like somebody knew somebody, though. So this guy, like all of the people that I interviewed, after I got their job histories, I asked them, well, how did you get to where you are in your life? He said, oh, I worked 7 days a week all my life. Yeah, I've earned everything I got. And that was the predominant view. When I ask people, what made the most difference for you having the kind of life you said now? Only 8% said that they had help, and most of the time they meant they got an inheritance. 70% of jobs from 99% of the people, and no one thought about that when they thought about what had happened in their lives. Instead, when I asked them about issues of what's fair, and particularly about issues of racial inequality, they would say things like, well, why can't those people do it the way I did? And when they said that, they meant, of course, work hard and be motivated. They didn't think about, yes, do it the way I did, get some help from family and friends, and the people who earned the privileges to help you because of the kind of hoarded opportunities from past generations. So I'm going to stop there.
Nancy, thank you so much. That's okay, for your presentation. In classical theology, there is the sin of omission and commission. Old school racists were guilty of the sin of commission. New school racism, the sin of omission, omitting passing opportunities to disadvantaged communities. How do we sensitize a community who does not see the problem, who thinks they've worked hard, or they think they hit a home run and they were born on third base? How do you fix that?
Yeah, love that joke, by the way. Well, first of all, it's possible to have the kinds of outcomes that I'm talking about because we live in such segregated societies. People don't live with each other, they don't go to church together, they don't go to school together, and because of that, when a job opportunity comes along and they think, who could I mention this to? It happens to be the people they know are people like them. So if we don't formalize the access to good jobs in some way through public policy or through changing the practices of employers, then we have to focus in on making sure that people who live in different communities have some means of knowing when jobs are available, often before they're announced or advertised, and have an opportunity to be considered. Changing people's mind about this, you know, in general, this was one of the things that was part of my thesis and surprised me. Everybody that I talked to, I just told you about everyone having an inside edge. And yet, everybody I talked to said, of course I support civil rights, nobody should be discriminated against, everybody should have an equal opportunity, and they thought they were part of the solution instead of part of the problem. They thought racism was the problem, but they thought the racists were those other people. If those other people would just change their minds, then we wouldn't have these problems. They never considered that their own behaviors were essentially contributing to the continuation and reproduction of racial inequality.
According to the Huffington Post, the city that you're in now, Louisville, Kentucky, is ranked as the 4th most segregated city in America. Blacks network with each other like whites network with each other. The difference, however, is that blacks have less net to work with. Which brings the question that is a question of great discussion today, and that is the question of reparations. What is your opinion on that?
Well, obviously the issue of reparations is controversial and political, but my own view of it is that the justification for paying reparations, for example, to the Japanese because of their internment during World War II was because their property was seized, and therefore it was a recompense for having valued property taken from them. Certainly one could make a case that with 400 years of slavery and then 100 years of Jim Crow, that the property of labor, the value of labor, was taken from many blacks, and that there should be some recompense for that as well. Now, the difference is there are many fewer Japanese than there are African Americans, and there are a lot of complicated issues, but that's my view.
What gives you hope?
Well, again, there are a lot of things that give me hope. First of all, the reason I called my book The American Non-Dilemma was because whites do not have to face a moral dilemma about their participation in the existence of racial inequality. I was trying to write my book to call attention to the white participation in the reproduction of racial inequality so they would feel that moral dilemma. And in general, because everybody I talked to said they believe in civil rights, they don't think anyone should be discriminated against, if they had to confront their participation, I'm hoping that they would see things differently and support different public policies. Furthermore, there is demographic change going on. To the extent that the country becomes more multi-ethnic, more racially diverse, and people embrace that, I think that there will be some transformation, but there are several fault lines to consider. One is, will we increasingly, people have written about these things, essentially have talked about Asians, for example, as probationary whites. If Asians begin to think about themselves as white instead of as non-white, that will not contribute to the kind of multi-ethnic view. Many, many Hispanics think about themselves as white instead of non-white. So it depends over 50 years how Hispanics think of themselves. In general, depends whether the major fault line is going to be whites and non-whites or blacks and non-blacks. I'm hopeful that there are enough people who experience the benefits of having diverse, urban, cosmopolitan kinds of experiences that they will welcome immigrants and others and begin to believe that their own best interest is in having a more diverse society.
Nancy, we have 5 more minutes, and then after we finish, we will have a meet and greet time in KC's room, and those who want to come and have further conversation with you will have that opportunity. But right now, perhaps there are some questions that someone has. Miss Betty Baye, my sister. The mic, please.
But an observation that, for example, that many blacks do live feel compelled to be fair. And in being fair, they become a larger impediment to other African Americans coming into the system than it is for white people. So what happens is that we often get blacks who are in position who make absolutely no difference but perpetuate the favoritism to white people and have a higher standard for black people to be hired than they would for someone else who is white. And so I think that sometimes we get deluded because we see these black faces in white places, but they really are afraid to act like they may have favoritism, as they would say, for somebody else who's black.
Yeah, and there is some research to support that observation, but let me mention one other thing. Before I did this book, I did a large study of diversity among scientists and engineers, and we had information on performance appraisal, including who rated whom. And what we found in general in this study, it was 3,000 people across 24 major companies, that essentially US-born white men got rated higher above whatever performance they had compared to others. And it was not just white male supervisors that rated them higher, everybody rated them higher. Because US-born white men, being disproportionately in positions of authority and power and income and wealth, cognitively get associated with competence and worth, and we all buy into that. So we have to bring those things to the surface and understand those processes in order to change the way we understand who is worthy and able to do the job.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you, in your research, were you able to draw any conclusions to desperate outcomes such as mass incarceration, violence in communities? So were you able to draw some conclusions, a linear line between this employment research and desperate outcomes of violence in communities and mass incarceration and other?
Yeah. Because I only talk to white people, not directly, but let me mention two things. Given that I talked to a random sample of people, or randomly selected people in these different places, I did occasionally encounter people because they were giving me their life histories. These were white people, particularly white men, who had gotten in trouble with the law, had stolen some things, or they got involved with drugs. They didn't go to jail. Essentially, they got the benefit of the doubt and a second chance. So their lives were quite different because there was a floor to their downward mobility. The issue about incarceration for blacks, particularly black men, of course, is very much related to, did they get the opportunity to get into some of these jobs and have a different kind of life, or were they forced into other kinds of pathways, particularly at the time when certain segments of the society were seeing private prisons, for example, as a new profit opportunity. So I think these things are integrally related, but I didn't address them directly in this particular book.
Great presentation, thank you. I see basically an opportunity for those with white advantage to spread the wealth, spread the networking, stuff like this. To reference Dr. Cosby's point, sort of increasing the net worth in the black community, so there's more networking to do. The one that I have no idea where to begin, though, is the public policy perspective. Like, how would you even begin to tackle favoritism or networking? I mean, I'm really curious what you could begin to do in a public policy around that kind of area.
Well, there are many things that could be done. Certainly through, right after the Civil Rights Act was passed, and there was various executive orders to create more opportunity for blacks and others into jobs that they previously had not held, we had programs like Affirmative Action that worked very well, as a matter of fact, in terms of providing some access that people previously didn't have. The problem is that affirmative action is looked at as preference for blacks as opposed to ending preference for whites, which in fact that's what it was about. In fact, in many cases where affirmative action was used, whites did not lose jobs. They simply expanded the number to make a few places for blacks. For example, that happened in some of the steel firms and apprenticeship cases and so on. But beyond that, there are things that companies can do. There are things that can be done at the public sector in terms of providing educational support, providing community support, housing desegregation. There are a number of things that could be done. But certainly paying attention to the way that people get unearned access to jobs that pay a living wage is something that needs to be addressed. So essentially, individuals can do things by being much more cognizant of who they're helping and who they're not. Organizations, employers can do things by paying attention to their practices. I was mentioning that I was invited a few years ago to a conference sponsored by a Fortune 30 company, very passionate about diversity. They knew all about unconscious bias, but they thought about it as bias against minorities and women. And yet I learned later that day that this company hires half of their people from recommendations of their current employees. So of course they're going, and they reward them for that, which of course is going to reproduce the same kind of workforce. So their CEO who said the survival of the company depended on hiring a more diverse middle management, was engaging in practices essentially that guaranteed that their middle management was going to look the same way over the future.
First of all, I want to thank you so much for coming today. I am a student here at Simmons College of Kentucky, and I must say we are very much aware of the differential between white men and black women and stuff like that. My question to you is, now that we are aware of this and what is really going on, how can you help us that are college students now versus white colleges that have more advantages than us? How can you begin to bridge that gap so that we can get in that fold, we can get in that system? Who could come in here and open doors for us so that this will stop?
Well, you know the local situation better than I do, but certainly you'll respond to that?
I'll respond to this. At Simmons College, we're building a bridge of opportunity that has never been built before. The greatest bridge is not the bridge that they built in the suburbs of downtown, but it's the bridge that's being built in West Louisville that is taking people to opportunity. There's one piece of the bridge at Simmons that we have to fix. The kid, Thomas Queen, who is enrolled in Simmons, full-time student who will graduate with a bachelor's degree in business administration, needs to know that if he goes to school, if he works hard, if he graduates, that he can either do one of two things. Number one, find a job. Number two, start a business. The business community needs to partner with Simmons and tell the kids, if you get on this bridge and cross it, once you cross the bridge, this is the jobs that you will land in. If as a result of him coming to school, spending 4 years and working hard, he does not find a job, if he does not give it an opportunity in the workforce, then that will disincentivize the rest of the people in the neighborhood that he came from to think that there's no hope. So the best thing we can do is partner with institutions like Simmons that is providing the network that Nancy spoke of. I want to thank you for your brilliant work. And we will have a time of meet and greet in a moment. If somebody could take Nancy, she can go over there. And also with our Secretary of State. And we have a DVD of Claude Anderson's presentation last month. It is $10. Please purchase a copy of this because this helps to finance and underwrite this much needed forum. Eric Holder said that we need to have an honest conversation about race, and that's what we're doing at the West Louisville Forum. Support the forum, support Simmons College, and also other institutions, historic institutions in our community. Everyone should subscribe to one of the two oldest newspapers, black newspapers in America. The American Baptist newspaper right here in the city of Louisville is the oldest weekly Baptist newspaper in the United States of America, weekly. The Louisville Defender, the historic Louisville Defender, everyone should subscribe to the Louisville Defender, and they will have representatives out in the concourse. Thank you for coming. Next month, the Reverend Jesse Jackson will be here to respond to Donald Trump's question, what do you have to lose? Thank you so very much for coming.